So, after a good long while, a period of several of weeks, I'm finally circling back around to covering part 2 of Cervantes's Don Quixote. I plowed through this section of the book very recently. At the time that I'm recording this, I just finished part 2 this morning, and I spent only the last barely over a week reading it. I believe I only spent 8 days worth of time actually reading it, or 8 mornings. So like getting through 500 pages, especially of, something like this in 8 days, for me, that is no small thing. Like, that is very fast. I definitely plowed through the second part of Don Quixote, managed to finish it very well, and it was overall a very enjoyable experience. I loved it a lot, definitely enjoyed it more than part 1. If you want to know a little bit of my thoughts, particularly in regards to some of the specific scenes and moments of part 1, you can check out my reading diary that I did at this point like 5 weeks ago, or however many weeks ago it was. And I didn't actually go through the book in as much detail in that video as I thought I would. Definitely not as much as I'm going to be going over part 2 in this video. But yeah, you can check that out if you're interested. For now, let's just talk about a little bit of my spoiler-free impressions of part 2. And I gotta say that I was kind of right, but also not in the way that I thought I would be about the tonal shift of part 2. You see, parts 1 and 2 of Don Quixote were written about 10 years apart, and there's a little bit of context, a lot of Cervantes' own life that kind of changed him as a person in those 10 years, and there was also while he was writing, like, he was very nearly done with part 2, actually. Some people say that this happened like before he wrote part 2 and he did it as a reaction. He was actually a very good chunk of the way through part 2 when this happened, but like an apocryphal version of a part 2 of Don Quixote had been written by some anonymous person. I'm pretty sure we don't actually know who wrote it. It was some pen name that we never knew who actually did it. But that was a thing that motivated a little bit of this book. But with those 10 years that occurred between the parts, there's definitely a little bit of a shift that comes in there in terms of the writing, not necessarily the prose, because this is of course an English translation, so that specifically isn't necessarily going to come through, but in terms of how well the different intents of the part come through, and in terms of the tonal shift, like I've said a few times at this point, things are a little bit different. But what was that tonal shift? I think it's not so much of a shift like I was expecting it to be, and more of a slight refocus on account of the existence of part 1. First of all, part 2 is definitely a lot more humorous. It focuses a lot more on those humorous moments than part 1 does, which for me was a good thing, not least because it actually did that humor in a way that I preferred a little bit more. And a lot of that was because of the tone of it. And the other thing that part 2 does a lot different from part 1 is that it basically takes out all of the like sort of serious-esque side stories that kind of seem to happen a lot in part 1. And for the record, were my favorite parts of that first part. The first half of the book, I really like a lot of that serious stuff. I definitely liked it a lot more than the humor. So the fact that part 2 focuses more on the humor and basically doesn't have any side serious stuff, only a couple brief moments of it, that should be a problem, but it's actually not. It's the opposite. It was actually a very good decision, and I think Cervantes just got a lot better at writing the humor this time around with part 2. A huge reason why the humor of Don Quixote works so much better in the second part, in my experience, is because of the intermittent 10 years and the meta that Cervantes was able to inject into the narrative as a result. You see, within Don Quixote, part 1, well, the entire novel here is a story purportedly told by, oh man, I don't even remember the character's name off the top of my head, but he's tangential. He's not a real character. It's just the person from whom the story is being written about by Cervantes, the person who was able to write the history of Don Quixote de la Mancha, and therefore was able to be found by Cervantes, and so able to be translated to some degree and told. But with that being said, part one of the book, that first half of the history, itself becomes a story, itself becomes a book within the world of Don Quixote, and so the meta aspect of the back half of part two largely centers around interactions with people who are aware of Don Quixote, not least because of this print book that has been circulating around, so people know who he is, people know who Sancho Panza is, and even more meta, as like I kind of explained before, there was that apocryphal part two of Don Quixote that was written by somebody else that wasn't the same character, wasn't the same author, wasn't any of that stuff. Even that makes an appearance in part two of the actual history, because pretty close to the end of part two is when that happened, and so Cervantes wove that into the narrative as well. And the meta aspect of the humor is a lot of what worked. The meta stuff specifically worked for me, but also a lot of the reason why the humor just generally worked for me in part two was because of this meta, the availability of the meta story. Because characters within the world of the book of part two know who Don Quixote is, you wind up with various different characters, particularly the Duke and the Duchess. By the way, I'm not like spoiling any names here. That's literally those characters. That's all that they're called within the book, as far as I could tell. Pretty sure that's literally all they were called. The Duke and Duchess are kind of in on the joke with Sancho Panza and Don Quixote, not necessarily in the sense that they're all scheming together, but rather the Duke and Duchess are scheming against the other two, and thus a lot of the situations that the two are in for a solid like 200 pages of the book are because of the Duke and Duchess, and the humor that comes out of that is better because it's more, I mean, good faith maybe not isn't the right term, but it feels a little bit better than the humor in part one, which was very often just Sancho Panza and Don Quixote basically implicitly terrorizing normal people in their lives by being absolute crazy people, idiots, buffoons, you know, that kind of thing. Whereas here you have people who are making idiots and buffoons out of Don Quixote and Sancho Panza, but doing it in the fun way rather than, they're not being mean about it, they're being fun about it. And this wouldn't be a thing that was possible if these characters didn't know who they were and therefore weren't able to just play along with it, right? So that was something that I really appreciated, was the humor just worked a lot better for me. Also, in general, Don Quixote and Sancho Panza are far less tedious in part two of the book, so it ended up bothering me a lot less as well. Like I said, rather than bothering and like pissing off random people, they are toyed with by other people fully aware of their existence, and that's just a lot more fun for me. But that's about all that I can say without actually jumping into like actual scenes or spoilery moments of things that I enjoyed about part two. So I'll go ahead and take this moment to jump into the spoilers, which, you know, I kind of have headed in here in my notes as favorite moments, funniest scenes, etc. But like, I kind of just want to go more or less scene by scene, or sequence by sequence rather, of like all of the moments that like struck me as like legitimately amusing. And I'll talk about a couple of the ones that didn't work for me quite as much, because there's very few of those. But for all intents and purposes, this is going to be like, you know, basically a scene by scene, or rather sequence by sequence summary of part two, because just so much of it was very amusing. I do want to start this off, however, by saying that to prove my point of how much better this worked for me as a whole, the only scene that I outright disliked in part two, or rather, I guess there was another one that I didn't love, but the only one that I disliked was like the puppet show that Don Quixote ruins. That was basically the only sequence of the book that I didn't enjoy, or the only sequence of part two that I did not enjoy, and that's largely because of the tone of it, because it's of the people tolerating Don Quixote and him being incredibly dumb and him bothering people and ruining things for people, and that I don't find very funny. So like, that was like the one sequence that I didn't like, because it was of the sort of like part one style amusing humor that wasn't actually amusing to me. But yeah, basically every other stage of the adventure this time around was pretty amusing or otherwise memorable to me. So let's just kind of start off with how part two goes. I have several notes for how these several hundred pages go. The first 100 pages features a handful of sequences like learning about the meta-narrative, learning about the fact that Don Quixote and Sancho Panza have somehow had their history written into the world, that this book exists that tells of them, and now characters know about them. So you're learning about this at the very beginning of part 2. You'll learn about some of those exploits, and then you have people asking like why some of the errors of part 1 exists. This is actually something that was mentioned in like the introduction of Don Quixote, is that part 1 specifically features a handful of like continuity and consistency errors that some translations account for, including this translation, but the original publishing of part 1 does not include some of those errors being fixed. So you have errors, and within part 2 you have that meta angle where like Sancho Panza has to explain like the mismatch in continuity error with relation to his donkey at one point in time from part 1 because of those continuity errors, and that's pretty amusing. Within my translation, those continuity errors are fixed, but they are explained about how they weren't in the original. So like there's a little bit of a mismatch there between the two parts now because of the fix, but you know, that's just how things go sometimes. In either case, you have more scenes such as Don Quixote determining that he's going to suit back up and Sancho's going to come out with him and they're going to go knight-erranting again, even though after part 1 it was like at a state where they probably shouldn't do this, and then all of a sudden they're gone again, and then all of a sudden we have inscriptions of like gravestones and stuff like that for these characters. But they went on an adventure that we don't have the history for yet. Part 2 is that continued history. But even that takes place after enough time where that first history now exists in the world. That meta angle is very cool. The first 100 pages also feature a scene which honestly runs like through the entirety of part 2, basically, which is Don Quixote and Sancho Panza meeting Don Quixote's supposed the lady whom he supposedly serves. This person doesn't actually exist, but it's Dulcinea del Toboso, and meeting her as like an ugly peasant whom Sancho Panza tricks Don Quixote into believing is Dulcinea because he doesn't want to bother with this particular leg of the sequence anymore. So he tricks Don Quixote and so knows that Don Quixote's wrong about Dulcinea being enchanted, which is like something that goes through the entirety of the book, or the entirety of part 2, which is very funny. I found this very amusing. It's like Sancho knows that Don Quixote's crazy, but he still continues to go along with it and doesn't find a way to be able to convince Don Quixote otherwise, and he actually does try to a couple of times, but it doesn't work out. But like that's the first 100 pages. I believe these next 100 pages of part 2 are nearly the most packed outside of the last 100 pages. But you have scenes like Sancho Panza and Don Quixote meeting another knight called the Knight of the Spangles / the Forest, because both of these are used in the chapter for some reason, which is just another character from the village named Sansón Carrasco. And these two duel, you know, in real life it's Sansón Carrasco, but Don Quixote doesn't believe as much. He's pretty convinced that it's somebody who was enchanted to appear as Sansón as soon as he was defeated. But in either case, the Knight of the Spangles is defeated by Don Quixote, whereas Sansón's intention was to defeat Don Quixote, so that the agreement of the fight was like, you have to do whatever the other one wants if you're defeated. And Sansón was going to defeat Don Quixote and then sentence him to staying at home for a year in hopes that this Don Quixote madness would disappear. It fails. So that was a fun little duel there, and Sansón Carrasco gets pretty well hurt and he has to be sent home instead. You have the challenging of the king's lions, where Don Quixote comes across a transport of lions across the countryside and is like, I am challenging these lions because I'm a knight errant, but the lions don't do anything, so they're able to not cause a huge problem. The only reason this scene was amusing and not really annoying was because the lions didn't actually bother to fight Don Quixote, so nothing bad actually happened here. So I did actually find that to be pretty funny because of that, in spite of that even. Sancho Panza and Don Quixote are joined by Don Diego, whom Don Quixote calls Knight of the Green Topcoat, going home with him and this kind of little mini adventure was one of my favorite parts of part 2 for sure, because there was a lot more poetry here, not least because at home you meet Don Diego's son, and his son's poetry is very good. Part 2, the entirety of Don Quixote randomly has some random like ballads and, other different poems and stuff sprinkled throughout. But I gotta say, the poetry in part 2 is by and large incredible, whereas the poetry in part 1 was like fine, it was serviceable. There's a lot of poetry right at the beginning of the book that just doesn't really mean much and that I didn't really care for, but in part 2 basically all the bouts of poetry are really, really, really great, and this was definitely one of those sequences that showcased that, where it's like, man, even I really liked that poem. That was awesome. Several moments that I'll definitely remember for a long time because of that. You shortly thereafter have a very fun wedding sequence, which features like the Camacho the rich versus Basilio the poor. That whole sequence is very entertaining. This woman who was set to marry Basilio the poor, but instead decided not to, and instead is going to be marrying Camacho the rich. Basilio the poor ends up scheming to basically interrupt wedding ceremonies and stuff like that, and like fall upon a sword and confess his love, and basically convince the woman to instead take his hand in marriage in his dying moments as like a sort of thing of pity. And this event all happens, but then it turns out to be a ruse. Falling upon the sword was a pre-planned thing where there was a particular like tube with some fake blood in it that would pop when he fell on the sword, so he didn't actually injure himself. Just everything about this whole wedding sequence was really, really fun. I loved it a ton. It was just so good. It honestly, part 2 was worth reading, honestly, probably just for that section, but there's a lot of other great sections as well. You've following even this sequence, you then have the Cave of Montesinos, which is hilarious in its absurdity because Don Quixote is like lowered into a cave that he's only in for like a half hour or something like that, but he comes out and is convinced that he's been in there for like 3 days, and that he's had these discussions with these people who've been dead for a very long time, and that he's seen more stuff to do with Dulcinea del Toboso, who's been enchanted, even though, again, Sancho Panza knows that she wasn't actually enchanted, and this is all made up. So what Don Quixote says happened in the cave certainly could not have happened, but just that story, that retelling of what happened in the cave was very fun. Again, shortly thereafter, you have the adventure of you meet a couple random characters who tell some of their own story about like braying donkeys and trying to search for a braying donkey in the forest, and how you have a couple characters who can supposedly imitate a donkey's little sound that they make so well that they mistake each other for donkeys. And like, that was an amusing little tangent of a side story that only lasted a few pages really, but I really loved it. It was very funny. You also have adventures regarding the puppeteer and the not foretelling, but like foretelling and soothsaying is not the right term, I forget the term, but a monkey who can tell you about your past and your present, which is a very funny concept. This sequence started really well, but then the puppet show wasn't my favorite. This moves us into the next 100 pages, which are a little bit less engaging than the first couple hundred for me. Like I said at the beginning here, the puppet show definitely wasn't my favorite, although there was actually a little bit of poetry that happened at the beginning of the puppet show that was so dang good, because like the beginning of the puppet show has several characters introducing themselves through poetry, and there's like, I want to say at least 8 characters in that puppet show, and you only get 4 of the poems, and then it just doesn't do the poems for the others. And I was actually so sad when this happened, because I wanted the other 4 characters to have the poems, because the other 4 were so good. Yeah, it is definitely, I just loved the poems in part 2 of Don Quixote just a lot. They were really, really, really great. But the rest of the puppet show definitely wasn't my favorite, though. I was partway through Don Quixote, for some reason, just gets convinced that's what's happening. He gets convinced that what's happening in the puppet show is actually happening, and so he, as a knight errant, decides to get involved and just destroys this puppeteer's puppets just entirely, which is just so... It bothers me. Like I said, this isn't the funny type of humor. I find this too real. It's not funny at that point when you're just completely destroying things. So I didn't enjoy the puppet show in totality because of that, even though there were aspects of it that I did enjoy. I enjoyed the sequence with the monkey. I enjoyed the poetry at the beginning of the puppet show, but the way that it ended just really pissed me off personally, so I found it hard to enjoy in an amusing sense. You have the enchanted boat. That little story was somewhat amusing, but also kind of followed along that same track of like, a little bit too real. You're actually bothering up other people's lives by what you've done here. So that bothered me a little bit. You definitely had a sequence of like 30, 40 pages in here that were like, I don't know, this is kind of reverting back to the humor of part one that I didn't enjoy very much. I don't know how well this is going to go if this continues for much longer. Fortunately, it doesn't, because very soon after this, you have the sequence where Don Quixote and Sancho Panza meet the Duke and Duchess. This episode starts here and continues for basically the next 200 pages, and it is incredible. Everything that is set up by these two characters, or that is in any way involved with these two characters, is just really, really great. For example, when you have Don Quixote and Sancho Panza meet the Duke and Duchess, you have a little side tangent story where Sancho is actually meeting with the Duchess privately, and he tells her he knows that he knows that Don Quixote is just full of crap, right? Because he made up the fact that Dulcinea del Toboso, who doesn't actually exist, is supposedly enchanted, but Don Quixote takes it as fact. But since Sancho Panza made up that enchantment, he is able to say, like, I know he's wrong about some of these things. I'm beginning to wonder about his sanity a little bit. But then the Duchess decides to flip that on his head and convince Sancho Panza that he has actually been enchanted, and that's part of why the confusion is there. Sancho Panza thinks about that he made up that enchantment, but he didn't, type of thing. He's able to be convinced of that. So you're able to have Sancho back on the train, so to speak, back on the bandwagon, I guess, with Don Quixote and the Duke and Duchess. The Duchess tells the story to the Duke, and the two of them are like, okay, we're going to play with them. Like, we're just going to have a bit of fun here. And boy, do they have a lot of fun here. You have an entire sequence where Dulcinea del Toboso is being enchanted, or rather, a sequence goes through where she's going to be enchanted so long as Sancho Panza lashes himself like 3,300 times, which is just absolutely absurd. But that is something that happens, and I found that whole sequence to be funny. There's also a sequence where they take a supposedly flying wooden horse to go disenchant some character named Dolores Dueña, who, basically all the characters in these stories that are posed by the Duke and Duchess are played by other characters in the Duke's and Duchess's house. So you come to recognize some of them, and some of the other characters start to recognize them in some of their different forms, but just the stories that they play with in here are just so very fun. You have the Duke also, quote unquote, giving Sancho Panza a governorship, and Don Quixote giving good advice about how to run that, which is a pretty endearing scene, even though I find the arguments that like the back and forth of they love each other, but also they like just argue and call each other mean names to be a little bit over the top sometimes. But even in spite of that, the governorship sequence of the book is also very fun, because like the next 100 pages from this point, nearly the entirety of it, it's like the least packed to talk about here. There's only a few bullet points that I have here, because basically all of it is Sancho Panza being a governor, quote unquote, of some place, which most of it is just him like making judgments upon various different totally made up cases, surely made up cases of court law, basically, to just be a judge. Like, those were all really fun to read. I found that really super engaging. You have, during this whole sequence, Don Quixote being stuck in with the Duke and Duchess as well, with various different sequences here that are pretty funny. Including dealing with a particular character called Altisidora, who is apparently fallen in love with him, and is that he has to reject the advances of, because he is a knight of Dulcinea del Toboso and can't do anything about anybody else. So that's pretty entertaining. And then you have, some moments of Sancho Panza's family being involved with the governorship, not directly, but like letters being exchanged between these few locations, all that kind of stuff, which was pretty cute in a way. This is like all that happened in those 100 pages, but it was just so fun. I loved those 100 pages a ton. But yeah, so there was that. And then you have the last 100 pages of part 2, which are a little bit more hit or miss, definitely the most hit or miss of part 2 for me, but arguably the most packed. So let's just kind of jump into some of these sequences. You have, the end of the primary sequence involving the Duke and Duchess and that whole kind of episode of stories with Don Quixote solving some drama related to one of the dueñas, Doña Rodriguez's daughter, and some offender who promised to marry her but has since denied ever having said that, and Don Quixote is supposed to have a battle with him, and if he wins, then he has to marry the daughter of Doña Rodriguez, and if Don Quixote loses, then the other man doesn't have to do any marrying. This sequence was pretty entertaining because the way that it is solved is before the fight, because the young man who, this is kind of totally against the plan of the Duke, because all of this is planned by the Duke. Like, everybody has a part to play here. Like, this is just all a stage at this point. This young man decides, it's like, no, I actually kind of want to marry that gal, so I'm going to solve the problem by doing the exact opposite of what I'm being paid to do here at this moment. So that was funny subversion of what we were expecting to happen in that way. You have Sancho Panza returning to Don Quixote, returning to the Duke and Duchess, so that because Don Quixote's still there, in which you have a small little sequence of Sancho Panza falling into a ditch with his donkey, which was pretty amusing that Don Quixote is able to help him out of. That was an amusing little side story there. Don Quixote and Sancho Panza leave the Duke and Duchess and discover the apocryphal history. This is the point in time in which the apocryphal history second part of Don Quixote is discovered within the world of the story. And like I said earlier, the digger dive on the meta-narrative aspect of this book is just, it's so fun in this way. It's kind of a serendipitous timing as well, because it's all comes out after the Duke and Duchess stuff. So now you have a new focus where you're like, have a little bit more focus on that meta narrative again, which is fun. But then you have another more extended sequence, I guess, with various different short little stories in there, where it's a trip of these characters to Barcelona. And this trip had a little bit more hit or miss material in there. This is definitely part of the book that I struggled the most with, or at least part 2 that I struggled the most with over this past week reading it. And that was because you had great sequences where Don Quixote and Sancho Panza are taken in by bandits, or rather they're captured by bandits. But that brief story was really, really fun. You also have the tale of the enchanted bust in here somewhere, which was really funny as well. But you have also the trip to the galleys and like that whole like sort of battle sequence sort of that happens. That was like a little bit too dramatic and serious and sudden to really work. This was like the one time that part 2 really tries to revert back to a little bit more of a serious like side story vibe, like what part 1 did a lot. And that didn't really work for me. You have a character recounting their story very much in that manner in this moment, where it just didn't really work for me. The only reason why it worked is because when Sancho Panza was returning from his governorship to the Duke and Duchess's estate, he met a character named like Quixote, I believe his name was, or something like that. And this dramatic side story is Quixote's daughter, who he had been separated from. So you have a little bit of tying of those connections there, which is cool in its own way, like an internal narrative type of way. But otherwise, this serious side story here didn't really work for me, unfortunately. But then you have sequences after this which are fun, which is the most notable one is Sansón Carrasco appearing again, but instead of being the Knight of the Spangles who was defeated, he is now the Knight of the White Moon, and he's here to challenge Don Quixote again in the same manner, because again, he just wants Don Quixote to go home and not be crazy. So he makes now a second attempt to defeat Don Quixote, and this time he actually wins. And this actually like crushes Don Quixote's spirit and sees him return home. But that fight was fun, and the characters, Don Quixote and Sancho Panza returning home, all the stuff that's going on there is, it's all right. It's not the best. It's not the worst. Just wasn't super memorable in that way. I liked the fight though. But you do have a moment while they're going home where they stop at the Duke and Duchess's estate one last time, where they have to revive Altisidora for some reason, because apparently when Don Quixote left, Altisidora died in her heartbreak. So now Don Quixote and Sancho Panza have to do some things to revive her, and then she is revived. So that sequence was entertaining, but also a little bit random. I don't think we entirely needed it, but I guess it did kind of, revert once again an internal narrative type of way to the Altisidora mention that I made before. So like it was good in that way. Not my favorite, but it is basically at this point that Don Quixote has basically decided that he's going to return home to become a shepherd for the 1 year that he now has to stay at home because of agreement with the Knight of the White Moon, or Sanson Carrasco. But in the process, once they return home, you have some reunions and stuff, and those are all pretty cute. But Don Quixote actually gets sick and dies, so you're in the last 10 pages of the book here at this point, the last chapter, and it's like, okay, well, how are you going to end the book here in one last chapter? You're just going to say that Don Quixote came out of his sanity and decided not to be a shepherd now, and that's just the end of his story? So I was a little bit worried about what would happen, but of course by this point I was also still worried about how part 2 would connect to part 1, because I think I mentioned this in the last diary. I'm not entirely sure, but I hope I did. That was that at the end of part 1 you have Cervantes basically including as the last chapter, including at the very end of the last chapter, a bunch of poems and engravings, so to speak, from or rubbings rather, from tombstones, that were this is the text of the tombstones of Don Quixote and several other characters of this narrative. And so at the end of part 2, it's okay, so how are you going to tie this back to Don Quixote being dead? Because he's very much alive right now. It's because Don Quixote wakes up one morning and realizes that he was just absolutely crazy, and he's going to repent. He's going to apologize for what he's done. He makes a will, basically divvies out his estate. He's sick and dying, and then he dies, and that's the end of the book. And it made the more meta aspect of the story a little bit more plausible, like I said, with the end of part 1, with including the tombstone of Don Quixote sort of in the book there. It was okay, so Don Quixote now has to die here. How does the timing of this going to work? It's because he just dies right there basically as soon as he gets home, which is amusing in a morbid way, but it totally works out. The timing of it works out. I just really liked it. But yeah, that was basically an entire summary of all of part 2. I kind of wish I'd done something similar to that for the first diary, but alas, this was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed part 2 a lot. I had a lot of fun with it. I don't think I'm ever going to read Don Quixote again, but part 2 was totally worth it. I was a little bit more variable about part 1, where it was this is somewhere in the 3 to 4 star range, where it's yeah, this is good, but there's enough of it that's not really clicking for me, even though other parts are still really clicking for me. Part 2 is definitely more of this is 5 stars basically the entire time. You have maybe a total of 50 or something pages out of the 500 pages of it that are not 5-star worthy, and even that's 3 star. It's fine, it's not awful, it's just okay. But the rest of it is really, really good. So on balance, I think Don Quixote is a book that I'll remember quite fondly for a long time, largely because of part 2. It was just really, really fun. So that is the end of this diary, I guess. Thank you for watching me ramble. If you did, if you're one of the few people who watches this video, especially all the way through, the first diary did not do very well at all, which doesn't surprise me that much, but also surprised me a little bit at the time. So I'd not be surprised if this video does very poorly, but I'm very appreciative of all the people who do watch it. If you read the book as well, which of these scenes that I've outlined in part 2 were your favorites? Are you like me? Did you prefer part 2 over part 1, or did you prefer part 1? Let me know in the comments below. I would sure be, interested in hearing from you. In either case, I've been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.